What film or series lit your fuse and made you have to tell stories on screen?
A show in, probably before everybody was born except me or Norman, was a show called The Phil Silver Show. You'll Never Get Rich. It was about Sergeant Bilko. Phil played Sergeant Bilko. And it was, to me, Lucy came first, but to me, this was a gaggle of crazy people together in a workplace that felt like a family. And I watched that show. Phil lived in the same building as my father and looked a lot like my father. So maybe there was some fatherly thrust for me to watch it, but it made me laugh so hard. And I was 15, 16, 17 years old. And, it was this disparate group of people who were brought together by the Army. And the way Phil made them a family. It was, they felt like they loved one another in real life. And so that certainly came across the screen. So there was this, homogeneous nature to this group of people, because there was war out there, it was, they were going in a battle, but you still laughed. You still laughed at the ridiculousness of the characters and the genius of Nate Heichen's writing. He was an amazing man. I met him only once, and he floored me with a joke, and that was it for me. We were playing golf, or we were at the clubhouse after a game of golf, and when I first came out to LA, maybe in '65 or something like that, for my first stint out there, he said to me, "Did you ever notice that Arthur Murray looks like he survived a hanging?" Now it's tough because the context. You have to know who Arthur Murray was. He was a dance teacher. He had studios, and he had the longest neck in the world. And so that was Nat's joke, and it was just crazy. So that was the first one. Then the ensuing ones were Dick Van Dyke, and one before that was Car 54, which was a kind of a spin-off of the Phil Silver Show. And then the Dick Van Dyke Show came, and that was, to me, the best before I started.
You had a very interesting window almost since you were a pup, in that your dad was a storied playwright, director, producer. He was around all these great people. Describe, if you can, how does that rub off on you? In some ways, I would imagine you might think, well, this is a hard act to follow. But in other ways, boy, talk about getting your fuse lit. Just the parties at your house, these incredibly creative people trying to outdo one another with just parlor conversation. What are some memories of that?
I remember my dad always had a New Year's Eve party, and my sister and I would go there, and we would kind of mingle with these people and occasionally get accosted by a drunk person who wanted to tell stories and everything like that. In fact, I was sitting down, I got a plate at the buffet, and I was sitting down, and a guy came and sat down right next to me. It was John Steinbeck, and John was in his cups. And he said to me, "Would you like to hear my Nobel Prize speech for literature?" And what is a 16-year-old going to say but yes? So he pulled out of his pocket these tattered old sheets of paper, began reading his speech to me. I didn't realize the gravity of it then, or really the importance of it then. They were my father's friends. I had My father was a legend. I had no intent of going into show business. I saw these people. I didn't think about being in the business. I met Cole Porter. I met Adolph Green, Betty Comden, Truman Capote, Frank Lesser, all these famous New York literati. And, they were, my dad's friends. So I like to think of my show business aspirations there were smoldering, but I had no idea they were. I like to say my father taught me when I didn't know I was learning. And so all those encounters with all those people and those moments, they inform my career now. No more than my father, who, literally I worked with him as a stage manager on plays and saw his creativity, saw how he treated people. He treated them with kindness. And he had the amazing ability to make things funny. And, he would take suggestions from actors and stuff like that. But at the end, whatever he put in there, he made the actors feel like that they were part of the creative process. So that's how I worked. And, thinking back of those New Year's Eve parties was more glorious than actually being at them, because I appreciate them now. I didn't appreciate them that much back then.
Wow. And it must be nice to have memories of your dad that way as a good guy. But you had a very interesting cutting of teeth stage on the stage. And I guess they called you Abe's kid. So you're doing that and you're having good and sometimes not great experiences with stars. You mentioned who was it, June Allison, who wasn't very particularly nice to you. And then you mentioned Mary Tyler Moore kind of falling into your arms, knowing that Breakfast at Tiffany's was going to be a flop, and there was a little bond created there. Talk a little bit about what you learned from working on the stage. And I found it very interesting that to you, every one of these pilots, and you've had like over 75 make it to series, you treated those pilots like they were Broadway plays. Talk about that a little bit and why that worked for you.
I started in the business as a stage manager. The stage manager is a guy on Broadway who is there every night and calls the cues for the curtain to come down, for the lights to go off, for the scenery to move on. So that was my job, and I was a stage manager on 40 Carats. And as a stage manager, you have to rehearse the understudies. The understudies are the people, if the actors don't show up, they have to take the place of the actor. I'll never forget, I got a call from, I remember his name was Alan Manson. He called me. He was an understudy in 40 Carats. He called me and he said, "What's going on tonight?" I said, "You're on." And he said, "How am I doing?" So, but anyway, on 40 Carats, I put June Allison in to replace Julie Harris. And she was not a real stage actress. It was really difficult to put her in the show. And then I put Zsa Zsa Gabor in the show. And Zsa Zsa she was amazing. She kind of took me under her wing and under her Hungarian wing. And she was in the show, and then she would do 40 Carats in different theaters around the country. And they would always call me to direct because I could wrangle her. She was, Zsa Zsa she was a star. She wasn't an actress. And so I knew the ins and outs of how to get her on the stage because she cared more about how she looked than when her cue was. So I would do that. So that's what my first inklings of directing was putting people into a show. But however, to go to the latter, preceding that, I was the assistant to the assistant stage manager on Breakfast at Tiffany's, which is an ill-fated musical my dad wrote based on the book Breakfast at Tiffany's. And the two stars were Richard Chamberlain and Mary Tyler Moore, Dr. Kildare and Laura Petrie. And so my job was to take these two people from Hollywood who really hadn't been on stage and to kind of guide them around the stage, make sure they had lunch, run lines with them, everything like that. So the show went out of town, and it was, not my dad's best work, but we were sold out because we had these two television stars. And then David Merrick, who was then the producer extraordinaire, didn't like the show, so he fired my father and hired Edward Albee. So I'm not sure where the nexus is with that, but so he also fired my father from directing, and I said to my dad, "Can I stay on the Titanic?" And he said, "Sure." So I stayed on the show, and we didn't go out of town again. We opened in New York as previews with Edward's script, and it was horrible. It was a horrible experience. And after every scene that Mary was in, she would come off crying and collapse into my arms. And it was just torture on her because the audience was talking back. And thankfully, Mr. Merrick had us only play 4 performances. So we closed on a Wednesday night, and we had Awakened Sardi's, and I sat with Mary for about a couple hours after the show until Grant Tinker, who was her husband, arrived from California to commiserate. And so I had this bond with her that later on turned out to be a boon for me.
Boy, I'll say. Now, as a young man watching that unfold, and it must have been particularly hard since your dad's writing got it off the ground, what do you learn from something like that? And I'm sure you've had projects that you thought had a chance that for whatever reason crater. What did that early experience teach you about rolling with the punches?
Well, I was not in as high profile position as my dad was on that show.
Yeah.
But as somebody, I was below the line. I was not a creative person on that show. So, that show goes away, you look for another job as a stage manager. And, you go from there. I was sad for my dad. It was in 1965. He had come off the hit of Cactus Flower. This was not a great show. It just was, I felt bad for my dad, but he had a revival when he did 40 Carats, which came after that.
Right.
So he got back on his feet there. But that happens. I've done a lot of shows in television where they just don't work. So you just, you keep punching, you go back and, light a fuse under another show, and hopefully that will take off. So I became, it taught me optimism and not to be depressed and not to sink into my couch and watch football, just to, know something else is out there.
Your dad was a creator in terms of being able to fill up that blank pages, which is really hard. You sort of figured out that wasn't your great strength, but you had a different strength. When did this all come together and suddenly you thought, this is what I can do?
Well, after college, I went to the Yale School of Drama to stay out of the draft. I didn't want to go to the Vietnam War. I went as a playwright, and I was not a writer, but I took a directing class that was taught by Nikos Sakharopoulos, one of the most famous directors in the regional theater. He started the Williamstown Theater. And I said, wow, maybe that's something I can do. So I got that. I put that in the back of my mind. And then, as I said, after 40 Carats in the late 60s, I would go out with Zsa and direct her in 40 Carats or Blithe Spirit she liked to do. And then I kind of hooked up in a theater in San Diego called the Off-Broadway Theater, where I was running it and doing plays with, it was a star-driven theater. I did Don Knotts and the Last of the Red Hot Lovers and Joanne Worley and Goodbye Charlie. So I got, I started directing then, and then one night I watched television on Saturday night, and there was a Mary Tyler Moore show on, and on television, and I noticed it was a show that was live. It was, it was shot live. It was edited after it was shot, but it was in front of an audience. And I said, wow, I'm doing a 2-hour show in front of an audience in a week, and they're doing 25 minutes in front of an audience. I think I can do that. So because of my past history with Mary, I wrote her a letter, which is in the book. And about 2 weeks later, I got a phone call from Grant Tinker, who was her husband, and he said, we're interested in theatrical directors because we have 4 multi-camera sitcoms, which are shows shot in front of a live audience, and we'd like to bring you out to do one show. This was in May of 1974. And so I packed my bags. I went out to California to do one show, and the rest is history.
We look back on the 70s in film as kind of an auteur's decade, a response to a lot of things that were going on in the world. And the way you discuss, Norman Lear's shows, All in the Family, Grant Tinker's shows, including Mary Tyler Moore. Why did all this change, and what was it like suddenly being in the center of this?
Well, a lot had to do with the anger in the country because of the war. And the Vietnam War was not a popular war. I don't think any war is popular, but that was a hard time. And the 60s was a revolution against that. And, in the 70s, or late 60s, I think All in the Family went on in 69.
Yeah.
And that was a show that was anti any other show that was on the air. That character of Archie Bunker was extraordinary. I could have never done that show. I always talk, Norman's a friend of mine. I said, that was his ballpark. I had a different ballpark. He was genius with that show. And so doing the Mary Tyler Moore show, when that came out, that was, that still had a couple of, mores that were, it was originally written about a divorced woman, and the network didn't want any part of it. So they chose to have Mary being jilted in a relationship. But it was the beginning of the 70s were beginning of a good time in the world of sitcom. I mean, there was still MASH on the air, which was the antithesis of it was kind of an anti-war show. But then these shows started where you had these big families, and people needed to laugh, and that was I think the genius of Grant in hiring his writers. He hired the best writers, and they did the Mary Tyler Moore, the Newhart, the Rhoda Show. They did Phyllis. It was just this hotbed of comedy that was desperately needed in the country.
We just went through this prolonged Writers Guild strike, and one of the big things that Guild leadership was talking about was, things like mini rooms and limiting the number of writers in a writer's room. And you write about how fertile were Norman Lear's writers' rooms and the MTM writers' rooms and all the great people who came out of there. What is your feeling about that and the need to protect the ecosystem, which is getting harder in this day and age when everything is about the bottom line and appealing to Wall Street and things like that?
Yeah, it's a shame. I used to, when I started directing, I used to go into the writer's room after I would rehearse when they were doing a rewrite, just to hear what they wanted to do, and hear them pitch and stuff like that. And there was usually 8 to 10 writers in the room. It was great. Of course, there were 26 shows back then, so the economics are not the same as they are now. But I don't know. I think on sitcoms there's still a big room. It's the drama shows. It's the drama shows that have the small rooms, because they do 6 or 8. On the sitcoms now, they do the writers' room on Frasier was big, and on the reboot, and but the dramas, they don't, for some reason they don't need that many writers, because there are not that many episodes being done, and so it was tough. Right now, it's tough for a drama writer to make a living, or it's now tough for any writer to make a living. It's something that I'm totally on the writer's side for, that the more writers in the room, the merrier, the better the show, because you never know where good ideas are going to come from. And screw the economics, just pay them, and you'll be rewarded if you have a good show.
Now, as you were finding your voice as a director, what series did you watch that was so good it made you question, wow, can I play in this? Do I belong here? Can I play in this game?
Well, yeah, that's a tough question for me, because again, I watched the Dick Van Dyke and Lucy and Car 54 and Phil Silver's show without any aspirations. I didn't, they were just background noise for me. Watching them, I had no. And then when I always thought I could do it because it was theater, and I was pretty good at doing that. And so when I got hired on the Mary Tyler Moore Show, that was the show. And when I did, after that show, I knew I could do anything. It was a scary experience walking into that stage with Ed and Ted and Gavin and Valerie and Cloris and Mary staring me in the face. And who am I but a 33-year-old Pisha from New York who happened to have worked with the boss for 7 weeks. And I was being brought on the show. I had no credentials. After the first reading of the show, which we always do on a Monday, I said to Grant Tinker, in a sea of Danish, I get a bagel. It was a bad script, but I worked hard on it. Well, Mary moves into Rose's apartment, and so it's a story about 2 people who have only worked together now, working together and living together. That was the premise. I went down and I rehearsed. And I was rehearsing stuff like I knew it was going to change, so I was like rearranging deck chairs in the Titanic. And, we would rehearse one scene, and then the new scene would come down, so I'd have to rehearse that. Mary hated the script, so I was dealing with all of that, and I was everything I could do to try to make it funny. I quoted Shakespeare. In the last scene, when Lou is saying goodbye to the apartment because they decide it's best that he moves out, they're sitting on suitcases. I said to them, just think of this as the cherry orchard. When you guys, you're leaving, I think it's the cherry orchard, you're leaving, you're going to Moscow, and you're saying goodbye. I don't know where that came from. I have no idea. But I plugged away on that show, and just before we shot the show, Mary came over to me and said, we feel our investment in you has worked out. I'll never forget those words. That was in October of 1974. And the minute that show was over, I got Newhart's, I got Bob Crane shows, I got Paul Sand shows to do, because they realized that they had a young director who knew theater. You can't learn how to talk to actors and how to move actors. You can learn how to place the cameras so you capture the action. But unless, my dad used to say, most people see the world this way, I see the world this way. So you gotta know what's funny and where the best place to tell a joke is and stuff like that. So once I got all those other shows, I knew I was on my way.
You've been involved in so many that hit, from Newhart to Cheers to Frasier to Mike and Molly and her just outsized physical comic abilities, and Taxi, and there's so many of them. Friends. You know, when you're sitting there and you're evaluating, because I know you said that you had passed on Seinfeld, what do you look for? What is the commonality, the common thread that gives a sitcom a chance to live beyond the pilot?
It's a multi-step process. The first thing is the script. It's what's on the page. The concept is not important to me. It's the execution of the situation. Cheers is a show about a bar. Friends is a show about 6 people in a coffee house. Taxi is a show about a group of people trying to get out of a joint. That's the first thing. The second thing is I need to meet with the writers of the show to find out if they can defend their material and are not defensive about it. In other words, if I have a lot of notes, and some of them are good and some of them are bad, and that's the writer's job to figure out which is which. But if I give you notes, I want you to defend why you did something, but not say, no, we're going to leave it because it's funny. I can't work with anybody like that. It's got to be a relationship it's a marriage between me and the writers. And then you have to have casting. You got to be lucky in casting. And the example I use is in 1994, I did 6 pilots, I did 4 pilots. And the 4th pilot, the last pilot I did, was Friends at the end of pilot season, and those 6 people were available. So, the luck of the draw. And once you get a cast, they put you on the air, and you got to make sure you're on a network where you're going to be seen. You know, with the shows I do, there's nobody in the shows, casting or writing wise, that the people are going to say at home, oh my God, I'm going to watch that show because Ted Danson's in it. They never knew who Ted Danson was before Cheers. So you gotta put the show at a place where it like at an 8:30 or a 9:30 slot after an 8 o'clock show or a 9 o'clock show. So it doesn't have to open an hour. So those are the 4 or 5 major ingredients you need. And then the rest is up to keeping up the writing and continuing to tell good stories, and hopefully an audience will find you. I don't know when Seinfeld did it come out in the air in 93 and 94. I don't remember. I was doing Cheers in 93. In 94, I was doing Frasier. So there was some aspects of that. Plus, to me, when I initially read it, I think they had shot 6 episodes. That's more. Brandon sent it to me just to see an episode. And it was funny, but for me, it was not my cup of tea, really. Because I don't feel, that show, there were a lot of people who were cynical in that show. I think the preponderance of people are cynical. And I have trouble. I don't mind one cynical person, but 4, and I love that show. I told Jerry that, it just was not my cup of tea.
Usually in film, directors rule the roost. In television, it's showrunners. But it's very interesting to look at the way that you've approached it, because, you meet with these writers, and in a way, they probably just out of habit think that you're auditioning for them, but you don't see it that way. They're auditioning for you. Give me a sense as to what, in your mind, the director's place in the television world, and why you've had so many successes. I feel like maybe your formula is a right formula.
Well, when I started out, I was not auditioning writers. They were auditioning me. Not until Cheers came along and I got my cojones did I start to flex my muscle. So in the beginning, I would take anything. I did a pilot called Roosevelt and Truman about 2 bail bondsmen, One of them being Philip Michael Thomas. He was one of them. And Michael Keaton had one line on the show. So I would do anything just to expose myself to writers. And I was not as, I kind of stayed in the background on those early shows. You know, and then Taxi was I was working with the MTM guys, Jim Brooks and Ed Weinberger, Stan Daniels, and Dave Davis, and I was subservient to them. I did have a chance to flex my muscle with the actors. And so in working with Danny and Judd and Jeff and Mary Lou and Tony and Andy and Chris Lloyd, I got to be able to say, let's try this when I was working alone with the actors. I would have a run-through for the writers, and then after the run, you know, and then occasionally in those run-throughs, I would put in something, a piece of business. And I'll never forget, we were onto one of these run-throughs, and I did, one of the actors did a piece of business, and the writer turned around to me and said, "What the hell was that?" And I said, you know, if you allow me to create, I'm going to create, but you can't intimidate me because all of my creations are not going to be great. So I began to be able to flex my muscles a little bit. And then on Cheers, which is a show that I was a co-creator on, thanks to Glenn and Les, I was then, you know, I could be more forceful and more creative. And after Cheers, when I would do pilots, I would take the writers out to meet with them before I read the script and then take them out to meet with them. And as I said before, I would give them notes, and I wanted to know that they could defend their material, not be defensive on it. You know, the first time that happened was, I think I did the pilot of Night Court, and Reinhold Wiggy, I went and I met him and we talked and we hit it off, and he respected me and I respected him, and the rest is history.
Wow. Well, now, what would you say was the big obstacle that you had to overcome to allow you to turn these television influences into your own language as a director?
It was the beginning. That was the hard part. When I didn't have any credibility. You know, you become a guest director on a show. And I would go into a show without credibility. And I would have to play by the rules of the show. The rules the showrunners had, the rules that the cast had. You know, after Mary, I did a Newhart. So that was a structured show. Bob only rehearsed twice. So I had to be able to play by the rules. But when you play by the rules, there are moments when you can be creative. And in talking to young directors, young sitcom directors, I say, please don't be traffic cops. Don't go in there and just move actors around. Create. Die with your boots on. Try stuff. You know, there's opportunity. It is a writer's-driven medium, but there's an opportunity to try stuff. So I think that was the most difficult times for me.
Watching Frasier was like being reintroduced to an old friend. Give me a sense as to what burned in you to revisit old terrain and get this show off to the right start the way you did.
A simple Kelsey call. That's it. We've had, next year will be 40 years since the character of Frasier Crane appeared on the stage at Cheers, and we've been through a number of battles together, and we're still great friends, and we respect one another, and we have a shorthand that nobody else has. And to be able, you know, in this times of the pandemic and everything like that, when you couldn't have a live audience, to hear the laughter on a show is just incredibly invigorating to me, and it just makes me hope that they'll make another 10 and I can do a few more. I had nothing to do with the creative process of the script. That was Chris Harris and Joe Cristalli. But, when Kelsey called, I said, send me a script. And, in reading the script, it was really well written, deftly handled. They worked on it for a long time because this project has been, 10 years in the works, different incarnations and everything like that, all of which I had nothing to do with. And then I met with them, I talked with them, and, because I was there to help make the show good and there to help protect the character of Frasier, which is so important to me and so important to Kelsey. And so, that was my goal.